All right, let's just jump right into this explainer. Today, we're laying out the strategic game board of the new US, China, and Russia triadic power dynamic. Think of this as your high-level diplomatic briefing. For 3 decades, we lived in a world where the US was literally the sole undisputed superpower. But, as we're going to see, that era, it's over. We've officially entered this highly complex and honestly pretty fragile triangle of great power competition that is totally reshaping global stability.
Here's a quick look at the roadmap for this briefing. We're going to hit the end of the unipolar era, the new triadic game board, that Sino-Russian economic axis, the chip war, military budgets and nukes, and finally, how middle powers are hedging their bets. Let's get into it.
Module 1. The end of the unipolar era, the shattered illusion.
So for decades, Western strategy was built entirely around this concept called the liberal peace thesis. Basically, it was this foundational assumption that if we just integrated nations like China and Russia into the global economic system, the wealth and trade would automatically moderate their behavior. The hope was it would turn them into peaceful status quo powers. It was a beautiful idea, right? But spoiler alert, it turned out to be a completely shattered illusion.
Looking at this timeline, you can actually see how that illusion fell apart in stages. It kicked off with the Soviet collapse back in 1991. That was the start of the unipolar moment. But then, look at 1999, the NATO bombing of Serbia. That was a huge turning point that really deeply disillusioned Russia about Western intentions. Then you've got China entering the WTO in 2001, which just absolutely supercharged their economy. These milestones slowly chipped away at American unipolarity, all culminating in this massive geopolitical earthquake in 2014 when Russia illegally annexed Crimea. That right there, that was the exact moment the world definitively pivoted back to great power competition.
All right, moving to Module 2, the triadic power game, a new board.
To really understand this, we have to contrast the old strategic board with the new one. The Cold War, that was basically a rigid two-player chess match. Simple bipolarity, a super clear ideological divide, completely separated economies, and a zero-sum game. Today's era is way more like a three-dimensional game of Go. We're talking multipolarity, mixed ideologies, and deep, deep economic interdependence. To put that into perspective, the US and China traded over $580 billion in goods in 2024 alone. You just can't flip the board over today without completely tanking your own economy.
So how do you manage this incredibly unstable multipolarity? Well, the US is now relying heavily on a doctrine called integrated deterrence. Because let's face it, we aren't just fighting tanks with tanks anymore. Washington is actively weaving together conventional military might with cyber operations, space tools, and some really heavy economic statecraft like sanctions and export controls. It's the whole shebang, deployed to contain both Beijing and Moscow simultaneously, aiming to deter aggression across literally every conceivable domain.
Which brings us to Module 3, the Sino-Russian economic axis, a no-limits era? Just look at this number, $245 billion. That staggering figure is their record bilateral trade in 2024. What you really need to take away here is just how incredibly fast this relationship has deepened. Facing crushing Western sanctions, Russia pivoted hard to the east. And crucially, a massive chunk of this trade is now being settled in yuan and rubles. They are intentionally bypassing the US dollar to blunt America's global financial leverage.
But as you can see here, this is a highly asymmetric partnership. Russia's isolation has basically forced it into deep, deep energy dependence on China. Russia is supplying heavily discounted oil, gas, coal, timber, and giving access to select military tech. In return, China provides the absolute lifeline of consumer goods and, more importantly, dual-use tech. We're talking electronics and machine tools that literally keep the Russian state functioning. So yeah, it's definitely not an equal partnership. China holds immense leverage here.
So, as analysts, your key takeaway is to constantly ask yourselves this: is the Sino-Russian partnership a durable, permanent alliance, or is it just a transactional convenience fueled by Western sanctions and cheap energy? The evidence suggests that even though they aren't bound by a formal defense treaty, their shared goal of undermining US hegemony makes this alignment much more durable, and frankly, a lot more dangerous than many folks in Washington initially hoped.
All right, Module 4, the tech and chip war, the Silicon battleground.
We can actually trace the rapid escalation of this whole technological Cold War right here. Back in October 2022, the US rolled out these sweeping export controls to just completely cut China off from the most advanced AI chips. Those restrictions kept expanding through 2023 and 2024, adding over 140 Chinese companies to the entity list. But then, look at December 2025. There was this highly controversial partial policy reversal where the US allowed some advanced NVIDIA AI chips to be traded for a 25% revenue stake. It's a wild move, but it perfectly highlights this intense tug-of-war between protecting national security and serving domestic economic interests.
The absolutely crucial point here is understanding how these two strategies are colliding head-on. On one side, you have the US choke point strategy, right? They're trying to leverage global semiconductor supply chains to delay Chinese AI military applications. But on the flip side, you have China's response, this all-out state-backed push for indigenous manufacturing. And here's the kicker. Despite the US restrictions, China is making real gains. I mean, SMIC achieved 7-nanometer production, Huawei is scaling its Ascend AI chips, and DeepSeek is dropping highly competitive models. This tech war is a super high-stakes, ongoing race.
On to Module 5, Military Budgets and Nukes, Escalating Tensions.
The data tells a really clear story here. The United States is obviously still the undisputed heavyweight champion in military spending at $954 billion for 2025. But don't let that gap fool you for a second. China's official spending sits at $336 billion, which represents 31 consecutive years of budget increases. And when you adjust that for purchasing power, that gap narrows significantly. China is rapidly building a modern force specifically designed to challenge the US directly in the Indo-Pacific.
And unfortunately, these massive budgets are fueling some pretty alarming proliferation risks across all three of these nations. China is executing literally the fastest nuclear expansion in history. They're projected to have over 1,000 warheads by 2030. Russia just suspended the New START treaty and has openly lowered its threshold for nuclear use. Meanwhile, the conventional flashpoints are just red hot. In 2025 alone, China launched unprecedented maritime deployments in the South China Sea and ran those massive Justice Mission blockade simulations around Taiwan. The margin for error here is shrinking by the day, guys.
Let's open up our final section, Module 6, Hedging in a Multipolar World, the Middle Powers.
It's fascinating to see how crucial third-party nations are navigating this. They are heavily arming themselves to protect their own national interests in the middle of this triadic competition. Take India, spending over $86 billion to fiercely maintain its strategic autonomy while balancing ties between Washington and Moscow. Germany is spending $88.5 billion, completely pivoting its defense posture to counter the Russian threat in Europe. And Japan? They're stepping up dramatically with over $62 billion, engaging in AUKUS-adjacent cooperation to directly deter China in their own backyard.
Meanwhile, smaller states in the broader global south, they are playing a very calculated game. They don't see this triadic competition as some big ideological battle. They see it as a huge risk that needs to be managed. They are actively seeking strategic autonomy, hedging their bets, and capitalizing on the expansion of BRICS+. They're also cautiously utilizing China's Belt and Road Initiative. Their ultimate goal is just avoiding entrapment. They flat out refuse to get boxed into an exclusive alliance with the US, China, or Russia.
We're going to wrap up this briefing with a pretty sobering assessment from the CSIS Risk and Foresight Group. They noted that the highest probability future scenario is not a clean new Cold War bipolarity, but rather a loose multipolarity. And the reason this matters so much is because a loose multipolar world is fundamentally way more unpredictable and unstable than bipolarity. When you have three major nuclear powers, incredibly deep economic entanglements, and middle powers all acting independently, the risk of miscalculation is just off the charts.
Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought to ponder. As we officially transition out of the unipolar era and into this new world governed by three competing, deeply distrustful, and heavily armed powers, can global stability actually survive without a single dominant hegemon enforcing the rules? Or is conflict inevitably written into the very DNA of multipolarity? Think about how this shifting game board impacts everything from global supply chains to international security. And definitely keep this framework in mind as the game continues to unfold.